Well, today we're going to talk about human resources management, and this conversation is largely based on Chapter 9 in your textbook. So to start, I'd like to share my slides, and I hope that you can follow what's going on here. So we're going to cover several things. We're going to talk about human resource management process, HR planning, the way that companies attract, develop, retain, and separate with employees. And depending on how we do on time, we may talk about trends and issues in management. Maybe so, maybe not. So we'll figure that out. First of all, the human resources management process. It really consists of four different parts. It all starts with human resources planning. Here is when you have to figure out what kind of human resources you need, right? You need to understand your company strategy. You need to understand who you have, who you might be separating with in the near future. And this will help you determine what kind of employees you need. And for those employees, you definitely do run a job analysis. You figure out what responsibilities they need to take care of, and that will inform you where you look for employees, how you look for employees, and how you develop them. You then go on to attract employees, and there are definitely policies to deal with that. That has to do with recruitment and selection. You then develop employees, you prepare them for the jobs they will be performing, and essentially help them start, hit the ground running, if you will. And then once you have the people that perform the functions that you need them to perform, you have to work hard to retain them. There are multiple ways you can do that. You do compensation policies, health and safety. You definitely have to comply with regulations. So we'll talk about that in turn. But we're going to start with legal environment. Right? So employee relationship and human resource management policies are subject to quite heavy regulation by the federal agencies, state and local governments alike. And the key idea here is that all your employment policies should be subject to Equal Employment Opportunity Commission regulations. Basically, what it means is that you cannot discriminate. You have to give everyone equal chance to get employed, people who are obviously qualified for the position, and that in the process of such employment, looking for employees and extending offers, you only consider what's relevant and do not base your decision on some factors that are expressly prohibited uh, by the regulation from being considered. Those labor laws exist at all three levels of government: federal, state, and local. And they have to do with a lot of policies that have shown to be problematic in the past. Right. So when we talk about discrimination, obviously things like race, gender, national origin, religion, there's a there's a number of factors that are protected by the government, and you have to be extremely careful when considering those in your employment considerations. And in addition to that, even your pre-employment inquiries, right? So you gotta have to learn more about the people that you potentially be hiring. They are subject to those same regulations. So any questions that you may ask of your potential employees, they have to be directly related to their job requirements, to what they will be doing for the company. So they have to match occupational qualification. What it means is that in some cases, you actually can ask questions that otherwise would be prohibited. For instance, in higher education, there's a great number of universities and colleges that are affiliated with different religious institutions, and those are allowed to ask whether or not you practice a particular religion. They are exempt from those requirements that apply to other organizations. So depending on what company you'll be working for, which policies apply, which rules you have to follow, may be somewhat different from other organizations. So be alert and keep in mind that there is some inbuilt flexibility in those regulations. Beyond that legal environment for selecting employees and hiring employees. There are definitely very strong requirements for treating employees a particular way, things that pertain to harassment and especially sexual harassment. I suggest that you read that part in a textbook. It goes into detail quite closely. Now, the HR planning process, it starts with job analysis, right? You have to figure out what specific responsibilities do you need your candidates for. And based on those, once you've analyzed that, you come up with a realistic job preview, right? It's a job description that specifies exactly what the person will or will not be doing. How detailed it has to be is an open question. Sometimes organizations go out of the way to provide for any contingency. Other organizations do it quite superficially. So as long as you have a pretty good understanding for what's required of the candidate, you should be able to communicate that in a realistic job preview. And then obviously you proceed to job specification. This is where you provide a schematic description of the position so that you can classify it a particular way. Once that is done, you need to think of how you're going to attract your employees. And there are multiple recruiting sources that you can turn to. Um, the main of them, the most popular one of them, is employee referrals. It turns out that despite the proliferation of all the online job search engines and professional agencies, the majority of organizations, when they hire their employees, they rely on their current employees who can recommend someone they know, they trust. This is where they rely on their networking capabilities. There's also this notion of internal recruitment or mobility, right, or promotion from within. When there's a new opening in an organization, it is probably a good idea to offer that position to some of your current employees, or at least make it available to those who feel they're qualified. There are multiple reasons for doing that. One is those people are better prepared for the position because they know your organization well already. You don't really need to spend the organizational effort and resources trying to onboard them, train them, and explain how things are run. Two, it actually increases motivation for employees because they feel they could be promoted. And that is essential, right? This adds to both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And that's a good thing if you want to have an effective company um, that you manage. You may also turn to outside organizations, right? You may try to hire someone directly from your competitor. Again, that person will be highly qualified, will have the industry knowledge, and can potentially share within the confines of what's allowed um, some of the know-how that competitors may be utilizing, thus helping your company. You may turn to agencies, right? Different recruitment agencies that are out there. You can advertise your positions on the internet, and there is a great number of job boards, if you will, that you can consider. So you probably all know about monster.com or indeed.com. They are very active. They allow for a great number of things to be checked prior to those applicants' portfolios getting on your desk. So that potentially saves you a lot of effort screening the candidates. You also have walk-ins, right? You don't think about it much as a strategy for hiring, but a great number of companies actually hire employees who one day just walk in and ask for a job. So I had some family members who got their jobs like that. You probably know some of the people who've done that as well. So basically, those six are the main recruitment sources. Again, the main one is employee referrals. That's where most organizations get their people from. Internal mobility, internal recruitment is a good one because it helps with motivation. But there's a plethora of methods, plethora of places you can go to hire people. Now, the selection process itself. There are several steps that the organization has to go through. It typically starts with an application form. So this is where this realistic job preview is essential because you can ask the questions that are essential for your selection processes, right? It can help you narrow down the candidate pool quite substantially. So once you have those application forms in place, when the applicants fill those out, you can conduct screening interviews. That helps you to narrow the employee pool further to identify potentially the finalists for the position. And on many occasions, you actually have those employees, potential employees, go through testing. So you may give them problems. Google is known for that. Their potential employees, they give programming problems to solve, right? The logical problems to solve. They want to see how the people think about different algorithms and do things of that nature. When we hire in higher education, we actually have our candidates have a teaching presentation and research presentation. We want to be able to assess how they perform in a realistic environment. And from that point on, you probably have your preferred candidates. This is when you start looking at their background and conduct some reference checks. Uh, Reference checks used to be important, not so much anymore, primarily because you do provide as a job seeker your own references, and those people typically give you glowing reviews, not just because they know you, but also because they don't want to be subject to some lawsuit or anything of that nature. And then finally, you bring in the person, you bring in the finalist, you conduct this final interview, you negotiate for salary and benefits and whatnot, and then you actually hire. So that's essentially the process. In terms of the interview, there are different kinds. They can be structured or unstructured. With structured interviews, all candidates are asked the same list of prepared questions. And for most organizations, the very first round of interviews are structured. That's definitely the case here at St. Cloud State University. But the majority of companies, if they want to be compliant with all the regulations, will have to ask the same questions that are job related of any applicant they choose to interview. Beyond that, there are unstructured interviews. This is really this open-ended thing where you can ask any questions you want. And this is typically reserved for the later stages of the interviewing process when you try to get to know your candidates better, right? The candidates that you've deemed to be potentially qualified for the position. And then there's also the semi-structured interview, right? This is where you combine the structure, the same questions with unique questions or unplanned questions that you may ask of candidates. The type of questions, there are also obviously different ones. You may ask closed-ended questions, which primarily imply just a yes or no answer. Right? Do you have a driver's license? Do you have an experience? So those kind of things. Could also be open-ended questions. Uh, Tell me about yourself. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And those may be hard to answer, and it's really hard to guess for the applicant what kind of questions you may be asked if those are open-ended. So generally, it is a good idea to learn as much about the organization as possible so that you may tailor your answers to the problems that this organization faces. You may be asked a hypothetical question. So if such and such problem persists, if you have a customer complaining about this and that, how would you approach it? So those kind of questions. And behavioral questions. How would you behave in a specific situation, right? If a customer comes in with a specific problem, how would you deal with that? Finally, there are probing questions. Those are primarily asked if you want to flesh out something that's been left sort of unclear from the previous responses. Like what do you mean by those kind of questions? The interviewing steps. Well, first of all, there are two parts. You have to prepare for the interview, and then you have to conduct the interview. When you're preparing for the interview, you review the job description and specifications. You prepare this realistic job preview, as we talked about before, plan the type of interview, as we just discussed, develop questions for all candidates. Those are typically, sort of exclusively job related. This is how you try to assess the qualifications of the applicant. You develop a form, and then you develop questions for each applicant. This is where some flexibility is allowed. In terms of conducting the interview, well, obviously you have to open the interview, you welcome the candidate, you introduce yourself, you present the realistic job preview, then you ask your questions, introduce top candidates to coworkers, and then you close the interview. And these steps do not have to be done like on the same day, right? So it's a process, and you may go through multiple steps and have multiple parties engaged. So this is just the logic of the process. That's what it is. Once you've identified the people that you want to bring into the organization, right? So you make an offer, you reach an agreement, they sign. There's a process you go through to develop employees, to make them sort of understand what the organization stands for. It primarily starts with orientation. And I know that many of you are employed, so you've probably been through some of those orientation sessions. You definitely have been through the orientation session here at St. Cloud State when you joined the university. The whole point is, it tell about the organization, tell about the values, tell about what to expect and what's expected of you, but also give the employer resources so that when the issue or if some issue arises, he or she knows where to go to get it resolved. So it's really just the information sharing session. It's making the person ready to be employed with the company and be a part of it and understand how different parts of the organization work together. You also do this onboarding and newcomer socialization. Onboarding introduces the person to future colleagues, to how things are done at the organization. Socialization aims at almost basically, introducing the person to the organizational culture, getting to know the people, and hopefully developing some relationships that would enable the person to function effectively within the firm and then maybe have some interaction with people outside of the firm, because that is quite helpful as well. You also need to train and develop employees, and there is an important distinction here. Training refers to giving the employee skills required to perform the tasks for which that person was hired. Development refers to giving the employee skills that would be required to grow in the organization. So when we talked about internal mobility, internal recruitment, people applying for new positions within the organization, typically at a higher level, this is where development is really helpful, right? You develop your employees so that when the opportunity presents itself, they are ready to fill those positions. Training can be done on the job and off the job. Um, there are multiple modes that can be arranged and facilitated. And the one trend that is quite prominent right now is the so-called micro-learning. The idea here is that attention span is quite short for most people. So you try to organize lessons to be very compact, focused to the point, and you go for a large quantity of tightly compacted lessons. So that's the idea here. A big part of the human resources management process is performance appraisal. You definitely want to make sure that people you've hired are doing what they were hired to do. And to do that, you go through 4 different steps. It all starts again with job analysis. You have to figure out what it is that you're trying to assess, right? Remember, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So you've got to develop some standards and measures and measurement methods, and that's the essence of your step 2. At step 3, you conduct the informal performance appraisal. So that is meant to provide some coaching and discipline to the employees, and could be considered a part of development, actually. And then finally, you conduct formal performance appraisal. That is typically done quite infrequently, perhaps more frequently for new employees. The idea, again, is to provide the feedback to correct what needs to be corrected, or maybe if the employee really excels at what he or she is doing, to offer opportunities for promotion. So that's the essence of the performance appraisal philosophy. There are different ways that you can conduct performance appraisal, different kind of measurements, if you will. Um, with critical incidents file, you try to document like all the things that go wrong with that specific employee. The whole point here is that you do not necessarily want to penalize the person harshly when the first or second incidents of something occurs, but you want to have those issues and instances documented. You want to make sure that feedback is provided, and if the issue keeps recurring, you need to protect your organization. If you decide to let the employee go, you need to have some reasoning documented so that the employee cannot come back and sue the company or you as an HR manager. You can engage a great number of other methods, right? Narrative methods, where you sort of reflect on how the employee is doing, both positives and negatives. You can have a rating scale of some sort where there are elements of the job that are essential, and you'll rate the employee with respect to performance on those elements. Um, could be several dimensions, and you can rate them from like 1 to 10 or something like that. And you may also rank employees. That is, you identify whether or not this employee is in like top 5%, top 10%, the average employee, or maybe the bottom 10%, whichever the case might be. It potentially is helpful because if the organization faces some issues, it becomes pretty clear who you need to let go and who may be a good candidate for promotion. But unfortunately, having those rankings in place, right, forced rankings, because you have to put the person in one of those categories, meaning you have to put some people into those, the bottom 10% category. It does promote some political behavior among employees where they understand that in order to look good, they have to make someone else look bad. So it could be detrimental for the organizational morale, and this is something that you do not necessarily want to be part of your organization. Performance appraisal could be of two different kinds, evaluative and developmental. With evaluative performance appraisal, again, multiple steps. You make an appointment with an employee. You ask the employee to perform a self-assessment. And that is actually quite critical, right? You give the employee an opportunity to reflect on how he or she performs. And many employees would actually be very critical of their own performance, perhaps more so than you would be as a manager. But it is essential that they do reflect on what they've done right and wrong so that they are prepared for what's potentially coming. Then you yourself assess the employee performance, identify strengths and areas for improvement, and then you predict the employee's reaction and plan how to handle them. Right? If you want your evaluative performance appraisal session to go well, you have to be prepared for what could transpire. And then when you conduct the actual appraisal interview, obviously you open the interview, you explain the purpose, you explain what you'll be talking about, and how this whole session will go. You're going to go over the performance appraisal form, And then you compare your notes, right? Your notes and employee notes with respect to self-assessment. Together, you agree on strengths and areas of improvement, and then you conclude the interview, right? So you've provided the evaluation, that's that. Developmental performance appraisal aims at improving employee performance, right? So it's not just to provide evaluation, it's also to help the employee improve, increase efficiency, increase effectiveness, whatever the case might be. So obviously you make an appointment, you have the employee himself or herself develop objectives and plans for improving performance. Again, much like with self-assessment, it is critical that the employee takes an active role in planning where some effort is needed. So that's essential part. And then you yourself develop the objectives and plans for improving employee performance. At the interview itself, again, you open it, you agree on objectives, right? You specify that the goal is to see where the employee meets or exceeds the expectations and where some work is necessary. You develop together plans for meeting those objectives, and this is essential, you make a follow-up appointment. Because the goal of that interview is development of the employee, you want to follow up, you want to make sure that the employee goes through the steps that you've identified. And once that's in place, if everything is done, then your goals are met. And then you conclude the interview. So that's about it. With respect to retaining employees, it's actually a challenge. If you have a good person, you definitely want to retain in person. You don't want to invest in employees to only lose them due to turnover, which means not exclusively, but very often that you have to pay them decent salaries. You have to figure out whether your organization will be paying high or low. So obviously, if you're paying low, it's inexpensive for you to hire people, but employee turnover will be quite high. You'll keep investing in developing employees, and then you'll be losing them potentially to your competitors. So the decision to pay little may not necessarily be the best for the organization. There are different pay systems that your organization may choose. One is just wages, right? So hourly wages. If you're working part-time for Little Caesars, so you guys know I have a son, and so he's a senior at high school. He just started his position at Little Caesars. They pay him, I think, $12 an hour. And that's that, right? So really his pay is determined by how long, the hours he spends there, clocks in, clocks out, but there's really no incentives of any kind. So it's just, how long you spend there, that's it. A different system is paying salaries. Those could be weekly, monthly, or annual salaries. And there, it doesn't really matter how much, necessarily how long you spend at your work each day, as long as you get done what you need to get done. So the faculty at universities are paid their salaries, right? We have our annual compensation, and that's that. It doesn't really matter how long we spend preparing for classes, as long as we do a decent job. It doesn't matter how long we spend on our research and publishing, as long as we do. So there are some performance expectations for us. If we meet them, then we sort of can expect our salaries to be paid. And then there are also incentives. Um, it turns out that people work a lot better in most circumstances when organizations provide incentives for them to do that. There are different kinds of incentives. Could be piece rate, right? When I don't know if you work for some sort of a manufacturing company, they may be paying you a set amount for each piece that you produce, whatever widgets you're trying to make. So the more you make of those widgets, the more you make in terms of money. That's that. It does provide incentives for you to do a good job. You may also be getting commissions, which are also linked to the sort of the volume of your operations. If you're an insurance agent, you probably get commissions on each policy that you sell. If you're a car salesman, you're probably going to get commissions on each vehicle that you sell. So that also provides incentives for people to work hard, sell more, do more, and many companies employ these kind of incentives to increase effectiveness of their operations. You may provide to your employees some merit raises, and this is again where evaluative performance may come in handy. You may decide that each year, top 15% of your employees receive a particular raise, right? So it does add incentives to employees to work harder, to work smarter, and that's a good thing for the company. And then finally, there may be bonuses. And bonuses are rarely based on your individual performance. They are more of a sort of a, team performance metrics. If the organization does well, then everybody gets something. There are some organizations, some industries that are well known for their bonus policies, investment banks being one of those, but not too many organizations do that. And there are different reasons for that, which I will not go into today. You have to figure out how you're going to determine an employee's pay. So many companies have pretty sophisticated pay systems where there are different levels of employees. So you have to classify the employee initially at which level he or she starts. And that's a serious consideration, and it could be quite critical for your ability to retain that employee, right? So it's interestingly, it's not just the money as such, but it's the level at which you hire an employee. So sometimes having a higher level means more respect for the individual, and that could be even more effective, more important than the money itself. And then obviously benefits, right? So you have to consider benefits as well, things like health insurance, vacation time, sick leave, things of that nature. And then finally, the final thing that I will discuss at this session on human resources management is separating employees. Well, there are different circumstances in the lives of many organizations, and sometimes you have to let people go, right? Sometimes it happens on its own, the so-called attrition process, when people may leave for other jobs, they may choose to stop working for a time, right? So when we talk about maternity leaves, parental leaves, more generally, that would be that. People do retire. So there is always this process of people leaving the organization without you trying to do that, right? So that's called attrition. There are also circumstances when you may have to fire the employee, right? So we talked about performance appraisal. And if you have a person who consistently underperforms or maybe is engaged in different unlawful practices such as harassment, you have to document those, obviously, right? And this is where this critical incident file comes in very handy. But you may have to let people go. You want to be really careful not to wrongfully discharge a person because it may bite you at the end of the day. And again, this is why documenting everything is so critical. And there are other circumstances where, maybe due to things like the coronavirus, you have to downsize. You have to lay people off through no fault of their own. That is a very painful process. And when that happens, again, there are governmental policies in place to make sure people receive some support. Um, and what's happening right now illustrates it quite well. There are different federally mandated packages. States try to help out as well. But taken together, attrition, firing, and layoffs and downsizing describe how you go about separating employees. And that's the final piece of the human resource management policies that we've discussed in this session. So thank you for your attention. Please make sure to read the chapter as well. The lecture is not a substitute. It does talk about a lot of things that are not covered here. And, don't forget to take the quiz, and good luck on that.